Story 1. Face to Face with the Rake. Hey everyone. I've wrestled with whether or not to share this for months. It's something so unsettling that it haunts my dreams. But after reading similar experiences here, I felt compelled to share my story. This happened a few months ago, and it's an encounter I can only describe as a waking nightmare. It was a cold, dismal night in early April. 4 days, the weather had been relentlessly grim. Heavy rain that seemed to fall in sheets and a relentless wind that howled through the trees, bending them as if in a tortured dance. I live on the edge of a small rural town, surrounded by dense woods. My house is isolated, the nearest neighbor miles away. Despite the stormy weather, I decided to take my usual long walk through the woods, a habit I found oddly comforting. The forest was a dark, oppressive expanse, with ancient trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the night. Their twisted branches interwove above me, blocking out what little moonlight there was. The ground was a treacherous mire, each step sinking into the mud with a sucking sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the night. The rain pelted down with a relentless fury, creating a constant drumming noise that felt like a heartbeat echoing through the forest. As I pushed deeper into the woods, the familiar paths gave way to an eerie, unexplored terrain. My flashlight cut through the darkness, but its beam seemed swallowed by the oppressive blackness. I stumbled into a clearing that felt strangely out of place. In the center stood an old, decrepit shack, its silhouette barely discernible against the storm-lashed night sky. The sight of the shack was like something pulled straight from a nightmare. It looked ancient, as if it had been abandoned for decades, left to rot and decay in the depths of the forest. The wooden walls were warped and splintered, with large sections covered in a thick layer of moss and fungi. The roof was caving in, patches of it missing entirely, leaving gaping holes that allowed the rain to pour through. The entire structure leaned precariously to one side, as though it could collapse at any moment. The door, if you could even call it that, was hanging by a single rusted hinge, creaking and swaying slightly in the wind. As I stepped closer, I noticed the ground around the shack was littered with debris, broken glass, shattered pieces of wood, and something else. Something darker, like charred remains. The air was thick with a musty, damp odor, mixed with a faint metallic scent that set my nerves on edge. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread that clawed at my chest, I felt an inexplicable pull to explore the shack. I had always been curious about the unknown, but this felt different. This felt like I was being lured in, as if something was waiting for me inside. My hand shook slightly as I reached out and pushed the door open, the rusty hinge groaning loudly in protest. The interior was worse than the exterior. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a scene of utter ruin. The walls were lined with ancient, waterlogged wallpaper, peeling off in long, ragged strips. The floor was a mixture of rotting wood and damp earth, with large sections covered in a thick, sticky muck that squelched underfoot. Old furniture, long since decayed, was scattered haphazardly around the room. An overturned chair here, a broken table there, all coated in a thick layer of dust and mold. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the smell of decay. The stench was so overwhelming that I had to cover my mouth and nose with my sleeve to keep from gagging. It was as if the shack itself was rotting from the inside out, a forgotten relic slowly being reclaimed by the earth. Every breath I took filled my lungs with the foul odor, making me lightheaded and nauseous. Then, as my flashlight beam swept across the room, I noticed something in the farthest, darkest corner. At first, it looked like a pile of old rags or a discarded blanket, half hidden in the shadows. But as I stepped closer, the shape began to take on a more sinister form. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I realized that what I was looking at wasn't an inanimate object. The figure moved. It was subtle at first, a slight twitch like the shifting of a shadow. But then it began to rise, unfolding in a way that was horribly unnatural, as if its bones were bending in directions they shouldn't. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic light and shadows that made the figure's movement even more disjointed and terrifying. As the figure stood to its full height, I felt a cold, creeping dread settle into my bones. The creature was gaunt, horrifyingly so. Its skin was a sickly, almost translucent white, stretched so tightly over its skeletal frame that every bone was visible, pressing against the surface as though trying to break free. The skin itself looked almost too thin, like parchment or old, dried leather, crisscrossed with veins that stood out in sharp relief. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, with fingers that seemed impossibly long, each ending in a jagged claw-like nail that glinted faintly in the dim light. These claws scraped against the floor as the creature moved, producing a sound that sent shivers racing down my spine. The creature's joints popped and cracked as it straightened up, the noise unnervingly loud in the silence of the shack. But it was the face that truly filled me with horror. The creature's head was large and misshapen, with features that were a grotesque mockery of human anatomy. Its eyes were the most horrifying part, two dark, empty sockets that seemed to drink in the light, leaving nothing but a void. Staring into those eyes felt like gazing into an abyss, one that threatened to swallow me whole. There was no life in them, no soul, just an endless, black emptiness that radiated malevolence. Its mouth was stretched impossibly wide, far beyond what should have been possible, forming a hideous grin that exposed rows of needle-sharp teeth. The skin around its mouth was cracked and torn, as if it had been forced open too many times. The creature's breath was shallow and rasping, each exhalation accompanied by a soft, wet gurgle that suggested something foul lurking deep within its throat. The creature's gaze was locked onto mine, those empty sockets somehow conveying a horrific intent. It didn't make a sound, but the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken menace. The air around me felt charged, almost electrified, as if the very space we occupied was tainted by the creature's presence. My muscles tensed, my body urging me to flee, but I couldn't move. It was as though the creature's gaze had paralyzed me, trapping me in that moment of sheer terror. Suddenly, the creature moved again, this time with a horrifying speed that defied its previous sluggishness. It dropped to all fours, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, and began to crawl toward me with a jerky, spider-like motion. The way it moved was sickening, like something out of a twisted nightmare, its body contorting in ways that no living thing should be able to. The noise of its claws against the floorboards was a chilling staccato, each scratch echoing through the small space like a death knell. The creature's breath became louder, a ragged, wet sound that filled the air with a sickening, fetid odor. I could feel its cold, damp presence approaching, its eyes never leaving mine. The closer it got, the more I could see the grotesque details of its form. The sinewy muscles that seemed too tight, the way its skin rippled over its bones, and the faint, almost imperceptible movement beneath its flesh, as if something else was alive inside it. The smell of decay intensified, overwhelming my senses. I could feel my stomach churning, a nauseating mix of fear and revulsion. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body was frozen, locked in place by the sheer terror of what I was witnessing. Just when I thought it would reach me, its gaping maw inches from my face, something in me finally snapped. I turned and bolted out of the shack, my fear propelling me into the nightmare that awaited in the storm outside. As I bolted out of the shack, my heart was a frantic drumbeat in my chest. The storm was relentless, the rain pounding down like a torrential assault. Each step I took was a battle against the muddy ground that seemed to want to hold me back. My flashlight, which had been my only source of comfort, was now more of a liability, its beam flickering wildly and casting erratic shadows. The forest, usually so familiar, was transformed into a nightmarish labyrinth. The trees loomed like monstrous silhouettes, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The wind howled through the woods, making the rain appear like a curtain of ice, slashing against my face and obscuring my vision. The ground squelched beneath my feet, each step a struggle to maintain balance. Behind me, the sound of the creature's pursuit was a cacophony of terror. The scrape of its claws against the forest floor was intermittent but hauntingly close. There was a disturbingly rhythmic quality to the sound, like a twisted parody of footsteps, but distorted and inhuman. It moved with a speed that should have been impossible, a predatory grace that seemed to mock my desperate attempts to escape. I dared not look back. I could feel its presence, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to press against my back, urging me to run faster. My breath was ragged, each gasp of air burning my lungs, but I couldn't stop. The fear coursing through my veins was like a shot of adrenaline, driving me forward even as my muscles screamed in protest. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of the storm, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the wind roaring, but beneath it all, I could still hear it. The wet, slithering sound of its breath, like a constant reminder that it was right behind me, closing in. The scent of decay, stronger now, mingled with the fresh smell of the rain, creating a nauseating mixture that made me want to gag. I stumbled over a root, barely catching myself before I fell. Panic surged through me as I realized how close I had come to losing precious seconds. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, the beam flickering out as it hit the ground and rolled away. Darkness enveloped me, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I was blinded. The fear of what lurked behind me surged tenfold in that instant. I pushed forward, my arms outstretched, feeling my way through the blackness. The rain was now a solid wall of water, drenching me to the bone, making every movement sluggish and difficult. My clothes clung to my skin, heavy and sodden, dragging me down. But the thought of that creature, its empty eyes, its gaping maw, kept me moving, kept me fighting against the overwhelming urge to collapse in defeat. Then I heard it again, that awful scraping sound, much closer this time. It was as if the creature had sensed my momentary falter, and it was now inches from me, reaching out with those long clawed fingers. The sound was no longer behind me, it was to the side, as if it was flanking me, playing with me like a cat with a mouse. My breath caught in my throat, a strangled sob of terror escaping my lips. I was running out of time, running out of options. My only hope was to reach the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and the lights of my house might offer some semblance of safety. But that edge seemed miles away, an impossible distance that I could never cover in time. Suddenly, I broke through a dense thicket, and the ground sloped downward sharply. I lost my footing, tumbling headlong down a muddy incline. The world spun around me as I rolled, branches and rocks tearing at my clothes and skin. I hit the bottom hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Pain shot through my body, but I had no time to process it. I scrambled to my feet, disoriented and desperate, the taste of blood in my mouth. For a brief moment, everything was silent, save for the storm raging above. I looked around frantically, my eyes searching the darkness for any sign of the creature. The trees loomed like ominous sentinels, their branches whipping in the wind. I was soaked, filthy, and exhausted, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving. But then I saw it. Not more than 10 feet away, it was there, standing at the top of the incline I had just tumbled down. The creature's form was a grotesque silhouette against the stormy sky, its elongated limbs and hunched posture unmistakable. The rain lashed against its sickly white skin, and its head tilted slightly, as if it was studying me, contemplating its next move. In that moment, our eyes locked, or at least I felt as though it was looking directly at me, even though its sockets were empty voids. The terror that gripped me was beyond anything I had ever felt. It was a cold, paralyzing fear that made my limbs feel like lead. I was trapped in its gaze, unable to look away, unable to move, as though the very air around me had solidified. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there, its presence a looming threat that seemed to suck the very warmth from the air. Then it took a step forward, a deliberate, slow movement that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. The way it moved was wrong, unnatural, as though it was imitating human motion but had never actually walked before. Each step was accompanied by the sickening scrape of its claws against the wet earth, a sound that I knew would haunt me forever. The world seemed to narrow, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the creature. All I could hear was the beat of my own heart pounding in my ears, louder and louder, drowning out everything else. My survival instincts kicked in, and with a burst of adrenaline, I turned and fled, the pain in my body forgotten in the sheer desperation to escape. The forest was a blur around me as I ran, my feet slipping and sliding in the mud, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I could feel it behind me, that cold, malevolent presence that pressed down on me, urging me to move faster, to escape while I still could. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I pushed myself, it was always there, just behind me, its eyes, those empty, soulless voids, fixed on me with an intensity that burned into my soul. The storm intensified, the rain now a torrential downpour that made it almost impossible to see. My hair was plastered to my face, the water streaming into my eyes, blurring my vision even further. The wind howled like a beast, tearing at my clothes, trying to pull me back, to slow me down. But I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. To do so would mean certain death, or worse. The trees thinned out as I neared the edge of the forest, the lights of my house just barely visible through the sheets of rain. I was so close to safety, to the warmth and light that seemed like a distant memory now. But the creature was closing in, its footsteps, those sickening, scraping sounds, growing louder, closer, as if it was reaching out for me, its claws just inches from my skin. I stumbled, my foot catching on a hidden root, and I went down hard, the impact jarring every bone in my body. Pain exploded in my ankle, a sharp, white-hot agony that almost made me black out. But I couldn't afford to lose consciousness, couldn't afford to stay down. I forced myself to my feet, biting back a scream as I put weight on the injured ankle. The pain was excruciating, but I had no choice. I had to keep moving. The creature was right behind me now, so close that I could feel the cold emanating from it, like a shadow of death that was breathing down my neck. My house was just ahead, the porch light a beacon of hope in the darkness. I reached deep within myself, summoning every last ounce of strength I had left, and ran, each step a battle against the searing pain in my ankle. The last few yards felt like an eternity, every step a desperate plea for survival. I could hear it behind me, so close, the sound of its claws tearing through the air, reaching for me, ready to drag me back into the darkness. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My hand reached out, fingers brushing against the cold, wet metal of the door handle. I yanked the door open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me with a force that rattled the windows. I collapsed against the door, my body trembling uncontrollably, every muscle quivering with the aftershock of adrenaline and fear. My breaths came in ragged, shuddering gasps, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears so loud that it drowned out everything else. For a moment, everything was still. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the storm raging outside. I waited, my body tensed, expecting the door to burst open at any moment, expecting the creature to come crashing through, to finish what it had started. But nothing happened. Slowly I pushed myself up, wincing as I put weight on my injured ankle. I limped to the window, peeking out through the curtains, half expecting to see it standing there, watching me. But the yard was empty, the forest beyond shrouded in darkness. There was no sign of the creature, no sign that it had ever been there at all. But I knew better. I knew it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting, and it would always be waiting. I don't know what that thing was, a hallucination, a manifestation of my deepest fears, or something far more sinister. But whatever it was, it's real, and it's still out there. So, to anyone who reads this, please, if you ever find yourself in the woods at night and you see something, a figure, a shadow, something that doesn't belong, run. Don't look back. Don't try to rationalize it. Just run. Because some things are better left unseen. Story 2: The Rake. A haunting in the Appalachians. Hello everyone. I've been debating whether to share this story or not, but after countless sleepless nights and reading through other experiences, I think it's time. This encounter happened last summer, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where I've spent my entire life. I know these mountains like the back of my hand, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced. It was mid-July and I needed a break. Life had been hectic, and the idea of retreating to my family's cabin in the Appalachian Mountains seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin had been in my family for generations, nestled deep in the woods, far from any roads or towns. It's the kind of place where you can truly disconnect from the world, with no cell service, no internet, and the closest neighbor being miles away. The cabin itself is old but well maintained. It sits on a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a narrow dirt path leading to it. The trees are ancient, their branches twisting and interlocking above, forming a canopy that blocks out most of the sunlight. The air is thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds are the distant calls of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the clearing. The temperature had dropped, and a cool breeze whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of the forest. I unpacked my things, started a fire in the fireplace, and settled in for a quiet evening. The first night, a stranger in the woods. The first night was uneventful, but I felt a strange unease I couldn't shake. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. I chalked it up to being alone in such a remote place and tried to ignore the feeling. I spent the evening reading by the fire, letting the crackling flames and the warmth of the cabin lull me into a sense of security. By the time I headed to bed, the unease had faded somewhat, and I fell asleep quickly. But in the middle of the night, something woke me up. It wasn't a noise exactly, it was more like an overwhelming feeling of being watched. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there in the dark, listening intently for any sound. The cabin was silent, save for the occasional creak of the wooden beams as they settled. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It was a palpable presence, like a pair of eyes were locked on me from somewhere in the darkness. After what felt like hours, I finally drifted back to sleep, but it was a restless, fitful sleep filled with vague, unsettling dreams. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and on edge. The strange feeling from the night before still lingered, but I pushed it aside, determined to enjoy my time in the mountains. I decided to go for a hike, hoping the fresh air and exercise would clear my head. The forest was dense and overgrown, with the sunlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above. The ground was soft beneath my feet, covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air was cool and crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of birds. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then I would stop and listen, but the forest remained silent. It was an unnatural silence, as if all the wildlife had gone into hiding. The further I walked, the stronger the feeling grew, until I was constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. I pushed on, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. But then I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing hidden deep in the forest, I found a circle of dead animals. They were arranged in a perfect circle, their bodies twisted and broken, as if they had been dropped from a great height. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading to or from the clearing. It was as if they had simply fallen from the sky and died where they lay. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The scene was horrifying, but what terrified me the most was the fact that there was no logical explanation for it. It was as if something unnatural had been at work here, something that didn't belong in this world. I didn't stay in the clearing for long. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, and I felt an almost irresistible urge to run. I turned and headed back to the cabin, my pace quickening with each step. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, I barricaded myself in the cabin. I locked the doors and windows, drew the curtains, and sat by the fire with a shotgun at my side. The unease had turned into full-blown fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me, waiting. The hours dragged by, each one longer than the last. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. I tried to keep my mind occupied, but the tension in the air was palpable, like a coiled spring waiting to snap. Sometime after midnight, the noises started. At first, it was just a faint scratching sound like branches scraping against the side of the cabin. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder and more insistent, until it was clear that something was outside trying to get in. My heart raced as I gripped the shotgun tighter, my eyes fixed on the door. The scratching continued, growing more frantic, more desperate. It was as if whatever was out there knew I was inside and it was trying to find a way in. Then, suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to react at the first sign of danger. And then I heard it, a low guttural growl coming from just outside the door. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was deep and menacing, filled with a primal rage that sent chills down my spine. I could feel the floorboards vibrate beneath me as the growl reverberated through the cabin. I slowly stood up, keeping the shotgun aimed at the door. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling. I knew that whatever was outside was no ordinary animal. It was something far more dangerous, something that didn't belong in this world. The growl was followed by a heavy thud, as if something had thrown itself against the door. The wood creaked and groaned under the impact, but it held. For now. Then came the voice. It was a low, raspy whisper, barely audible over the howling wind. But there was something deeply unsettling about it, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, the words guttural and alien, as if spoken by a creature that had never known human speech. The voice sent a wave of terror through me, and I backed away from the door, my mind racing. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I knew that I couldn't stay here. I had to get out of the cabin, get away from whatever was trying to get in. I turned and ran toward the back of the cabin, where a small window looked out onto the forest. The window was my only escape route, but it was small, barely large enough for me to squeeze through. I pushed the curtains aside and looked out into the night. The forest was dark and silent, the trees swaying gently in the wind. There was no sign of whatever was outside, no movement, no sound. But I knew it was out there waiting for me. I quickly unlocked the window and pushed it open. The cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down my spine. I grabbed my backpack and slung it over my shoulder, then climbed up onto the windowsill. But just as I was about to climb out, I heard the door to the cabin splinter and crack. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the sound of something heavy moving through the cabin, its footsteps slow and deliberate. The growling was closer now, more intense, as if the creature was right behind me. I didn't wait to see what it was. I scrambled out of the window and dropped to the ground, landing in a crouch. The forest was dark and disorienting, the trees looming like shadowy giants all around me. I could hear the wind howling through the branches, and the distant calls of animals echoing in the night. But the most terrifying sound of all was the one I heard behind me, the sound of something large and heavy crawling through the window I had just escaped from. Eerie. The forest floor was uneven and treacherous, with roots and rocks jutting up from the ground. My legs burned with the effort, my lungs aching as I gulped down the cold night air. But I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down. The sound of that thing crawling through the forest, chasing me, was all the motivation I needed. It moved with an unnatural speed, covering the ground in long, loping strides. I could hear it behind me, the sound of its claws digging into the earth, the guttural growls that seemed to vibrate through the very air. I knew that if it caught me, I wouldn't stand a chance. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming an impenetrable wall of darkness. I could barely see where I was going, relying on instinct and memory to navigate the twisting paths. The underbrush tore at my clothes, and the branches whipped against my face, leaving stinging welts. I could feel the creature getting closer, its presence like a shadow that pressed down on me, suffocating me with fear. Every step I took was a desperate attempt to put more distance between us, but no matter how fast I ran, it was always there, just behind me, its breath hot on the back of my neck. I stumbled over a fallen tree, nearly losing my footing. My heart raced as I pushed myself back up, adrenaline surging through my veins. I couldn't afford to fall, couldn't afford to slow down, not even for a second. I could hear it closing in, the sound of its claws digging into the earth, the low growls that sent shivers down my spine. Then just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw it, a faint light in the distance. My heart leaped with hope as I realized it was the porch light of the nearest neighbor's cabin. If I could just make it there, I might have a chance. I pushed myself harder, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. The light grew brighter as I neared the cabin, but so did the sounds of the creature behind me. It was right on my heels now, so close that I could feel its presence like a dark cloud hovering over me. I burst out of the tree line and into the clearing, my legs pumping as I sprinted toward the cabin. The light was a beacon of hope in the darkness, but it felt so far away, like a distant star that I could never reach. The creature let out a deafening roar, and I felt a burst of cold air as it lunged for me. I could feel the wind from its swipe as its claws missed me by mere inches. The sheer force of it was enough to knock me off balance, and I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I kept running, my eyes fixed on the light, my mind focused on one thing: survival. I reached the cabin just as the creature closed in on me. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, could hear the sound of its claws tearing through the air. I slammed into the door with all my weight, nearly breaking it down in my desperation. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, and for a moment I thought I was done for. But then, by some miracle, the door swung open and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. The creature hit the door with a force that rattled the entire cabin, but it held. I backed away, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment there was silence. Then the creature let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the cabin. I could hear it scratching at the door, hear the wood creaking under the pressure. But the door held, and after what felt like an eternity, the sounds finally stopped. I stood there, trembling, my back against the wall, the shotgun clutched in my hands. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, afraid that any sound would draw it back. The cabin was silent, the only sound the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Finally, after what felt like hours, I dared to peek out the window. The clearing was empty. The creature was gone. I stayed in that cabin for the rest of the night, too terrified to move. I didn't sleep, didn't eat, just sat there, shotgun in hand, waiting for the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things and left, vowing never to return to the mountains alone. I don't know what that creature was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that it was something unnatural, something that didn't belong in this world. And it's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. So if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you hear something scratching at your door, something that doesn't sound quite right, run. Don't look back. Don't try to fight it. Just run.